It's been a chaotic weekend and a bit in the world of geopolitics. Having threatened to Iran's energy system over the weekend, on Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump suddenly changed his tune, announcing a 5-day postponement and claiming that the U.S. and Iran had had very good and productive conversations. This was quickly denied by Iranian officials who insisted that no negotiations had taken place and that Iran would continue fighting until its maximalist demands were met. So in this video, we're going to try to figure out what actually happened and explain why it's still hard to see the war ending anytime soon. Let's just start with a quick recap of what's happened over the past 72 hours or so. This story probably begins on Saturday, when Trump took to Truth Social to issue Iran a new ultimatum, warning that if the Strait of Hormuz didn't fully open within 48 hours, the U.S. would start hitting Iranian energy infrastructure. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who seem to be the dominant force within the Iranian state at the moment, essentially refused Trump's ultimatum and warned that if the U.S. did attack their energy infrastructure, they would respond with reciprocal attacks targeting energy infrastructure in nearby Arab countries and Israel. Unsurprisingly, the prospect of further escalation and strikes on energy infrastructure, which would presumably push global energy prices even higher, spooked the markets. When the oil markets opened on Sunday evening UK time, Brent crude was trading at about $113 a barrel, up from about $16 on Friday. Asian stock markets, which opened on Monday morning UK time a few hours before the American markets, suffered heavy losses, with South Korea's benchmark Kospi plunging 6.5% and Japan's benchmark Nikkei 225 falling 3.5%. Government bonds also sold off heavily, as investors predicted that governments would have to borrow more money to fund support packages for consumers, as they did during the 2022 energy crisis. Interestingly, U.S. government debt, which has traditionally been considered a safe haven asset and thus used to perform relatively well during crisis, also sold off, with the yield on 10-year bonds rising to nearly 4.5%, up from less than 4% when the war kicked off. Then, just a few hours before the U.S. stock markets opened, Trump suddenly announced on Truth Social that as a consequence of very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities, the U.S. would be postponing any strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure for 5 days. This provided immediate relief to the markets. Oil prices fell sharply, and both stocks and government bonds rallied on the prospect of de-escalation. However, barely an hour later, Iran's foreign ministry released a statement contradicting Trump, claiming that no talks had taken place and suggesting Trump had lied in order to calm energy prices and prepare military plans. Speaking to reporters a few hours later, Trump insisted that talks had taken place, claiming they happened on Sunday evening and that they were led by his Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff and son-in-law Jared Kushner. Mr. President's foreign ministry says, "You're not telling the truth when it comes to productive conversations everywhere. We're going to have to get themselves better public relations here. We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement." I would say almost all points of agreement. Perhaps that hasn't been conveyed. Communication, as you know, has been in business. They're unable to talk to each other. But we've had very strong talks. Mr. Waff, Mr. Kushner had them. Interestingly, Trump refused to name their Iranian counterpart, apparently because he didn't want him to be killed again. I don't want him to be killed. I don't want him to be killed. Nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants that job right now. Nobody's exactly looking forward to being the head of that particular country, but perhaps we'll be able to solve that problem. Mr. President, the Jerusalem Post then reported that Trump's interlocutor in Iran was the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a hardliner who's seen as being close to the Revolutionary Guard, before Axios claimed that Pakistan had organized a meeting between the U.S. and Iran for some time later this week. Again, however, this was quickly denied by Ghalibaf, who insisted on X that no negotiations with America have taken place and accused Trump and the Israeli media of producing fake news to manipulate financial and oil markets and to escape the quagmire in which America and Israel are trapped. Iranian and Arab media outlets then reported that the U.S. had reached out to Iran and proposed negotiations not with Wickoff and Kushner, but instead with Vice President J.D. Vance, but that Iran hadn't responded. While it's obviously impossible to know for sure, we think this is the most plausible explanation. The U.S. probably has reached out to Iran, presumably via intermediaries like Egypt and Pakistan. But it's hard to believe that any productive conversations, to quote Trump, have actually taken place, and Trump's U-turn on his earlier ultimatum was probably mostly motivated by anxieties about turmoil in financial markets. This would be consistent with a Bloomberg report published on Monday, which, citing sources inside the Trump administration, claimed that Trump's U-turn was designed in part to address market concerns and would also explain why his new 5-day deadline coincides with the market closing on Friday evening. So, what happens next? Well, the relatively positive reaction from the markets suggests they're optimistic about a deal. You can sort of see why. Trump seems keen to get out of Iran, which would in turn suggest that Iran has achieved its overarching strategic objective, namely re-establishing deterrence. While you might think that a hardliner like Ghalibaf would be unlikely to negotiate with the U.S., somewhat paradoxically, his reputation as a hardliner might actually afford him the required credibility to strike a deal. Iran also has at least some incentive to strike a deal, while further escalation would be bad news for Trump given the impact it would probably have on financial markets and the quagmire-related risks at play. It would also be bad news for Iran, especially because Iran's Gulf neighbors are apparently edging towards direct involvement in the war. To us, however, this all feels too optimistic by half, and we see at least 3 outstanding structural obstacles in the way of any deal. First, and most obviously, the two sides' negotiating positions are way too far apart. According to recent statements, Iran seems to be demanding at least 4 things: the closure of all U.S. military bases in the Persian Gulf, reparations for war-related damage, the removal of all economic sanctions, and some sort of security guarantee to guard against future aggression. On the other hand, according to a recent Axios report, the U.S. is demanding a total end to Iran's nuclear program with strict outside observation protocols, a 5-year pause on its missile program with strict limits thereafter, and a total cessation of support for its proxies. Even if we assume that both sides are articulating hyper-maximalist positions as a negotiating tactic, in other words, assume that both sides expect to make at least some concessions, it's very hard to see a middle ground here. Moreover, Trump still seems to be going for a Venezuela-style outcome in Iran, which feels quite naive at this point. The people within know who they are, they're very respected, and maybe one of them will be exactly what we're looking for. Look at Venezuela, how well that's working out. We are doing so well in Venezuela with oil and with the relationship between the president-elect and us, and maybe we find somebody like that. Second, there's a critical lack of trust. Trump has attacked Iran in the midst of negotiations twice in the past 9 months. Even if he were to offer some concessions, this still probably wouldn't be enough because Iran wouldn't trust him to keep his word. Third, and finally, Israel. As evidenced by the fact that Israel carried out a series of strikes on Iranian infrastructure after Trump announced his 5-day pause, Israel is clearly more enthusiastic about continuing the war than the U.S. is, and it's hard to see them accepting any deal. Maybe Trump will be able to force Netanyahu back down. But in recent history, Trump has usually ended up doing what Netanyahu wants rather than vice versa. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out now, which means that if you order a physical edition, it'll be shipped to you immediately. And if you buy a digital edition, it'll land in your inbox straight away. No pre-ordering, no waiting. Plus, if you subscribe while you're there using code SPRING26, you'll get your first copy for as little as $4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. One other thing to know is that if you're more of a listener than a reader, which would be fair enough, we are a YouTube channel after all, then this time round we've recorded every article in Too Long, with each of our writers doing their best audiobook impression while narrating their own articles. The New Age of Empires, written and read by Georgina Finley. If you want that, then you can sign up to our new Too Long and TLDDR Party bundle that gets you a copy of the magazine, but also access to TLDDR Party, our new subscription. Party members not only get access to the audio versions of every article, they also get access to our documentaries, like our new series, Leaders and Losers, and our upcoming documentary we're recording in Greenland right now. They get access to our behind-the-scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Our bonus podcast, The Last Move, their name printed in every issue of our magazine, and more. Find out more about TLDDR Party by clicking the link in the description, where you'll also find a link to subscribe to Too Long and our documentaries.